very basic level, which is what is capitalization, right? So when you purchase an asset, typically you're funding it with your own cash and cash from other people. And so the total dollars into the asset, that's called your capital. So typically it's broken down into two pieces: debt and equity. And that is your total capital. Well, that's spelled wrong. So that's your total capital. So it represents, the total assets invested. In this case, you're investing in a house. And so a simplified definition of investor, whether it's debt or equity, is just somebody who gives you money to purchase or improve that asset. There's a lot of super complicated structures you can do for debt and equity, but we're going to talk about some really basic structures. And so the first is equity investors. So equity investors are the ultimate owners of the asset. They take the most risk and they actually sit below the debt. So we wrote this like that on purpose. And so what that means is they're junior to the debt, which means they take more risk. So if there's losses, they take all the losses first before the debt takes the losses, but that also means they get the excess profits, And so you're typically, if you're buying your own house, you're typically the only equity investor in your house, if that makes sense. And so there's some advantages to taking on equity versus debt. So the first advantage is that they share all the risks. That means that, if you lose, $10,000 on a house and you have a 50-50 equity investor, you're going to lose 5 and they're going to lose 5. So they can also help you, because they're taking that risk with you, they can help you fund the down payment, and they're giving you more flexibility. There's typically no payback terms, and therefore there's no impact to your cash flow. And then they can also potentially sometimes bring other resources to the table, whether that's relationships with contractors, or in this case, or it could be debt investors or what have you. And then so there's also some disadvantages, which is, because they're taking the risk with you, they actually get the same upside as you do, assuming just plain vanilla equity. So if you both invest the same amount, you're going to make the same amount of money, and you have to share fully with those profits with them. And so that makes the money more expensive, and it costs you more out of pocket on the back end. And sometimes, they'll want to be more involved in the process, and they'll want to have their say because they put their money in, even though you want to be in charge of the process. So where do you find these people? Equity investors can be a little bit elusive. And so typically you want to start with friends and family. And after that, you can go to investment clubs, local real estate investor associations, and really networking is going to be the best way for you. You can join meetups, join Facebook groups, potentially go onto LinkedIn, really just put yourself out there and start networking. And that's going to be the best way to do that. And typically also with these equity investors, they're going to want to have some sort of track record behind you. So it's tough to get that on your first deal. We don't recommend going for that on your first deal or even your first few deals. And so then we have debt investors. So debt investors, they're going to be lending you the money, right? So you have to pay them back typically on a very scheduled basis. And they're going to be charging interest and fees, which is how they make their money. So if you're buying a house for yourself, typically the bank or the mortgage company is going to be your debt investor in this case. And so as real estate investors, we have a wider range of options. I'm going to cover the main 3, but there really are a huge wide range, which we'll cover in lives in the future. And so for our flippers, it's going to be banks, hard money lenders, and private lenders. And so we'll go through those in a second. So the main advantage to taking on debt investors is that you're limiting your capital up front, right? So if you have a house that's, costs $100K, you can typically get a bank to pay for up to 80% of that. So you only have to so the bank is going to put in 80%. So you're going to put only $20K down, right? And so if you make $20K, let's just say a 20% profit on this flip, you're gonna make $20K, and now you're left with 40, right? You only had to pay the bank back the 80, right? And you get to keep that entire 20% profit, and you've doubled your money, right? Because you're ending up with 40 rather than 20. And so you did this by putting in less money. And so that brings up another advantage, which is it massively increases your returns, but also it lets you diversify, right? So if you had 100K to invest and you got a bank to give you 80% across all of them, instead of just being able to buy one property, you could buy 5, right? Because you're only putting down 20 per properties. Now that ignores fees and other things, but for the sake of simplicity. And so on the flip side, there is some downsides to debt investing. One is you have that monthly payment, right? You have to come up with the interest and the principal repayment on a monthly basis, whether the house is losing money, it's burned down, whatever it is, you have to give them that money, right? They're not really taking that much risk. They are taking some risk, right? Because if all of your money, the house, in this case, for instance, if the house goes down by more than 20K, then that is the bank's problem. But up until that point, they get all of their money back no matter what happens. And so because of that, the higher interest rates can hurt you, especially if there are delays. So for a flipper, taking on a 10% piece of paper, whether it's from a bank or a hard money lender, isn't necessarily going to be a big problem, right? Because you're only going to hold it for 3 to 6 months. So that's really you're only paying 2.5% to 5%, right? Because you pay interest over the course of a year. And so if there are delays, that can potentially eat into your profits, right? And so we mentioned the 3 types. And so there's banks, private lenders, hard money lenders. So banks, that's pretty self-explanatory. That's going to be your JP Morgan Chases of the world, Wells Fargo's. And they're typically going to give you 80% of the purchase price on an investment property. And they're easy to find, but they're harder to get, right? So you'll typically need a track record of flipping deals similar to equity investors in order to get the significant bank financing. However, this will give you the lowest cost of capital. Typically, banks will lend, in the 3 to 5% range on an asset-backed loan, which this would be because we have a house. And so it's always worth a shot to go there, but can be more difficult. And then you have the private lenders. These are private individuals who are making loans to you. Similar to equity investors, they can be a bit elusive, but you're going to find them in a lot of the same places. So you want to, have to get out there and network to really find those. And then we have hard money lenders. So these are our non-bank private lending companies. This is the most typical source of funds for flippers. So typically you're going to be getting money from these guys at 8 to 12%. Usually it's more like 10 to 12, but if you have a track record, sometimes you can do lower than that, simply because these guys are taking on a higher risk because it's a flip, and so therefore they are charging you a higher interest rate. And so these are actually really easy to find, to the point where what you actually have to look at is scammers. So for me personally, just right ahead of this live, I went onto a Facebook group and just posted that I needed financing, and I had 10 people reach out. That was on one post I made. So it's really easy to find people who are willing to talk to you at the very least. And so, but you want to do some stuff to avoid getting scammed. And so one of the first biggest signals is that no lender, whether they be a bank, a hard money lender, or a private individual, is going to ask you for fees up front. The fees are going to be baked into the deal, and you're going to pay those off like the rest of the debt. And so if somebody's asking you for fees up front before the deal closes, that's almost certainly a scam. And you want to make sure that you're doing your due diligence. So don't just be sending money to people. Don't just be signing up for things without meeting the person. You want to form a personal relationship, especially with hard money lenders. With banks, they kind of they're established, so you don't have to worry about that. But for private individuals and hard money lenders, you want to establish a relationship with these people, see them face to face if possible, or at the very least get on a Zoom call if you're not comfortable meeting face to face, because not only will this protect you, you get to know the person, see if you trust them, but on the flip side, if everything goes well, if you form a great relationship with the person, maybe they'll fund your next deal, and so on and so forth. And so most private money lenders and hard money lenders, they lend on the deal, meaning they're not as worried about your track record and they're more focused on the financials of the deal. So they want to know what your purchase price is, what you think the after repair value is, aka what you think you can sell the house for. They're going to want to know what your repair costs are going to be, and what your timeline is, et cetera, et cetera. And so if they're not asking you those questions, you can be pretty certain that this person is either a neophyte and doesn't know what they're doing, and you might not want to work with them, or more likely they're a scammer again. And so, what else? You want to ask for references for these people if possible, at least 3 I would recommend, and you want to try and talk to those references rather than just have them email you. Again, it's a little bit harder to fake. And then, if somebody's charging you less than 9% interest, especially on your first deal, you can probably guess that they're going to be a scammer, although it's getting pretty competitive out there for hard money lenders, so that's not a hard and fast rule, but just something to consider. And so just to recap, there's debt and equity investors. Debt is really what you're going to be going after, especially for your first few deals. That is also known as leverage, right? And it's called leverage because you can, like a lever, you pull on something and it helps you lift something else, right? So what we're lifting here is our returns, and it's really an effective way to do that, and also diversify, lower your risk, right? Because you only have 20K in a deal, so if it goes south, that's your max risk. Whereas if you invested the whole thing cash, that's your max risk would be 100 in this case. So debt versus equity, we're going after debt. Bank financing is the best type of financing, but it's much harder to get and sometimes difficult to get, especially for flippers. And so after that, you're going for your private capital and your hard money lenders. Those are not necessarily in rank order, but it'll be easier to find the hard money lender. Just make sure you don't get scammed. So again, if you want to learn more about what to do once you have the financing, or how to find a deal that you ought to get financing for, join our first time flip profits group. The link's in my bio, and or you can PM me and I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. Thanks, bye.